Yeah, to set a little bit of background context for what I'm going to be talking about. So, yeah, my academic background is ecology, and ecology is the science of interconnection and interconnection of living systems. And I think psychedelics, they might seem sort of very much kind of their own thing, but one of the core facets of the psychedelic experience is interconnection. So they allow this direct experiential comprehension of this interconnection as opposed to just an intellectual understanding. So we are in the 6th great mass extinction of life on planet Earth due entirely to human actions on the biosphere. So earlier this year, the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Assessment Report was published. And this was a result of 145 world experts from 50 different countries looking back 50 years worth of data. It took 3 years to compile the most comprehensive assessment of its kind. And it painted a very grim picture of our situation. The loss of species, of ecological degradation is unprecedented and accelerating, and 1 million or so species are threatened with extinction. The systems on which all life on Earth depend are being degraded and destroyed. And the essential sort of conclusion from this report is without a sort of global mobilization, an ecological mobilization on the scale of World War II, we are in deep, deep trouble. There are a few interesting, more positive findings from this report. And one of the interesting things was that lands inhabited and sort of under the control of indigenous people were some of the only lands on Earth not undergoing ecological degradation of any kind. And this is really interesting in terms these indigenous groups live very nature-connected lives. They're, of all the human beings alive, they have the strongest, deepest connection to their land. And it seems that connection, as I'll sort of discuss, fosters this care and this concern. These indigenous groups tend to sort of view themselves as part of their environment and their habitat. So why would you destroy your habitat when it's sort of going to destroy you? Some of these groups use psychedelics. Not all of them, though. But that's sort of part of their practices in some parts of the world. So we are living increasingly disconnected lives. And this disconnection is occurring, manifesting on different scales. So disconnection from our core selves, disconnection from other people, disconnection from nature. This disconnection began when we started farming in terms of the disconnection from nature. As soon as we moved away from being hunter-gatherers and became farmers, it fundamentally changed the way we interacted with and viewed nature. Nature became a resource to be tamed and controlled. Certain species were prioritized over the existence of others. And in the wake of that, we started having these domesticated plants and animals fundamentally changed our species' destiny and domesticated us. It was a two-way domestication. We started living for the first time in large groups in cities, and that planted the seeds of our civilization as we know it today. But with that came increased urbanization, and more people were moving, becoming more sort of cut off from nature. But the most recent form of disconnection that seems to have occurred through technology, and particularly sort of like television and more recently the internet. And it seems, our screen addictions kind of render us prisoners of the paradox that the more we watch, the less we see of the world around us. And recent surveys have found that UK children, there's a few interesting, quite harrowing surveys, and one of them found that UK children know more Pokemon characters than common wildlife species. And I think it was 8-year-old kids, they spend less time outside on average than prison inmates, much to the horror of the prisoners who really value their outside time. So there was some really interesting research done at Imperial College as a part of the psilocybin major depression trials. And my good friend, Dr. Ros Rotz, did some very interesting qualitative research on people with major depression undergoing psilocybin therapy. And one of the interesting things she found, of the 17 of 20 people who responded to some degree to the psilocybin therapy, all independently described this feeling of disconnection as being part of their depression. And psilocybin worked in part by reconnecting them to themselves, to others, to the world at large. And it was interesting that none of these people undergoing the psilocybin therapy, none of them prior to their psilocybin session described this feeling of noticing or acknowledging they were disconnected from nature. It was only afterwards, during and afterwards, they sort of, re-remembered the importance of that connection. So essentially, disconnection on an interpersonal level is fueling the mental health crisis. So depression is on the rise and considered by the World Health Organization the #1 form of disability worldwide. So there's the interpersonal disconnection fueling the mental health crisis, and the disconnection from nature is fueling the environmental crisis. So let's zoom out for a second. So when astronauts view planet Earth from space, they tend to undergo a profound cognitive shift, a life-changing shift. And this is known as the overview effect. It can be summarized as truly transformative experiences involving senses of wonder and awe, unity with nature, transcendence and universal brotherhood. And the astronauts that have this experience, they tend to sort of become much more ecologically aware and conscious. They sort of behold the incredible beauty of planet Earth, but also its fragility. And so this particular photo is the Apollo 8 Earthrise photograph. So this was snapped on Christmas Eve 1968 by NASA astronaut Bill Anders, and has been described as the most important environmental photograph ever taken, and considered by some as the genesis of the environmental movement. As Bill Anders said of this photograph, we came all this way to explore the moon, and the most important thing is we discovered the Earth. Sort of a nice, interesting sort of psychedelic add-on to this story. Then Mary Prankster and writer Stuart Brand had some LSD in the winter of 1965 in San Francisco on a rooftop, and he sort of felt what he can almost perceive as the curvature of the Earth. And it made him wonder in turn, why had no one taken a photograph from the Earth from space yet when we'd been to space? It seemed like, a logical thing to do. So he came down off his trip, but the idea stayed, and he sort of embarked on this campaign, sending badges to NASA and Congress, printed with, why haven't we seen a whole photograph of the Earth from space yet? And he felt that the release of such a photograph, this photograph, would help facilitate people to live more conscientiously with the planet. Another useful term is the concept of biophilia, which can be considered the innate fondness we have for other life forms, the connections that human beings subconsciously seek with the rest of life. So we've spent 99.9% of our existence living in natural environments, so our psychology, our physiology is very much adapted to that. So, nature connection. Self-identification with nature, or nature-relatedness. There's a substantial body of research now to show that what degree of nature connection is correlated with things like decreased anxiety, increased vitality, life satisfaction, happiness, and improve psychological well-being at the trait and state level. So it's a very important health predictor indeed on the individual level. But also, importantly, is that one's degree of nature connection is perhaps the single strongest psychological predictor of pro-environmental behaviour. And it's interesting, so environmental knowledge, simply knowing about nature, is a much less strong predictor of this pro-environmental awareness. So that sort of emotional connection to one's environment, to nature, seems a very important part of the motivation for proactive behaviour. So, wouldn't it be good if we had tools that could induce the overview effect without the need of going to space, enhance our biophilia, and deepen our nature-relatedness? So, no prizes for guessing what those tools might be. They are, of course, the psychedelics, which have been used by some cultures for centuries or millennia. It's interesting to note that the great chemist, discoverer of LSD, inventor of LSD, Albert Hofmann, described profound feelings, like mystical feelings of nature connection in his younger days, like unity and oneness with nature. And when he subsequently experienced LSD, he described it as sort of producing this very identical state of connection and unity with the natural world. So this is a sort of testimonial from one of the people in the psilocybin depression study. Like Google Earth, I had zoomed out. For weeks afterwards, I was absolutely connected to myself, to every living thing, to the universe. And so this is nice. This is kind of insinuating that without the sort of the great cost and sort of rigmarole of going to space, that psychedelics can offer an alternative, perhaps more accessible route to a very similar perspective, vantage point. So awe. Stimuli that are vast, that transcend current frames of reference, and that require new schemata to accommodate what is being perceived. So, or it's this sort of the perception of being very small, the small self in relation to sort of the big self. And this seems to be a key mediator of a few powerful experiences that humans can undergo. So it's being linked to psychedelics, to out-of-body experiences, the experience of nature, and it seems linked to the pro-social effects that follow in the wake of that. So psychedelics were in widespread usage during the 1960s, and this was a time of sort of countercultural movements and activism. So the environmental movement really blossomed in the 60s, along with the civil rights and the anti-Vietnam War movement in the US. And so it's interesting, some of the sort of research that's coming out, psychedelics, as well as increasing our nature connection and pro-environmental awareness, they also seem to make people anti-authoritarian. There's this sort of profound sense of authority that can kind of come through the primary mystical experiences that psychedelics can catalyze, and that can be very threatening to existing power structures. President Nixon felt very strongly that LSD and other psychedelics made hippies, effectively. So banning them would sort of like cut off the root. And he may have sort of been onto something. But it's interesting now, obviously, like Extinction Rebellion is kind of like a modern wave of environmental activism, of course, partly founded on psychedelics. And XR here in the UK succeeded in getting the government to acknowledge a climate emergency, which is quite a feat. It remains, of course, to be seen how the government will sort of respond. So, in terms of what's going on with regards psychedelics making us more connected to nature, it seems to sort of, it's involved with the ego, the sense of self. So here, this image, which is part of the Imperial Beckley research program, is showing a sort of conceptualized representation of what's going on in the brain in terms of interconnection. So under an MRI. So under a high dose of psilocybin, your default mode network, which is considered to be a kind of fundamental neural component of the ego or the sense of self, is kind of relaxed and sort of dissolves. And that in turn facilitates this kind of expanded state of self-nature overlap. So it's worth kind of thinking about that psychedelics are agents of connection on all levels. On the level of the neuron, they induce synaptic and neurite formation. At the level of the brain, they increase global connectivity and communication of different parts of the brain. At the level of the self and interpersonally, they facilitate connection, as the depression research alludes to. They also increase connection to nature and the universe at large. So this is some research conducted by our very own David Luke. And yeah, it can be seen here that psilocybe mushrooms seem to be kind of ruling the roost in terms of their nature connection enhancing properties. And it's interesting as well, we can see kind of like ayahuasca is second for increasing concern, but lower down the list, fourth for increasing connection. And I think a possible interesting thing of that is ayahuasca tends to be done in quite sort of strictly monitored, often indoor type environments, and you're not really sort of going out into nature, whereas people on LSD and mushrooms are more likely to sort of, they're a bit more user-friendly psychedelics, and people are more likely to sort of go exploring and kind of interact with nature. As we can see here, ketamine users, fiends, are not probably going to usher in the new ecological age of Aquarius. So ketamine users probably consider psychedelic supplementation where that's legal, where that's a legal option. So psilocybin. The bulk of the psychedelic research so far has been on psilocybin. There was an interesting follow-up study to the classic Marsh Chapel experiment where divinity students at Harvard were given a high dose of psilocybin or placebo. And Rick Doblin of MAPS did a follow-up study. So he tracked down almost all these people who underwent this research and interviewed them a quarter of a century later. And one of the sort of repeating themes coming up was even a quarter century later, those people still credited that single psilocybin experience as facilitating an increased connection to and appreciation for life and nature. So in both clinical and non-clinical populations, we're seeing this nature connection increase. So there's a few correlative studies that show that psychedelic users tend to be more nature connected, but it's hard to say sort of what causes what. But there are some studies now showing that it does seem to have a causative prospective role to play. So with some of the Imperial depression subjects, they did a follow-up sort of study on their levels of nature relatedness, and 7 to 12 months later, they still rated very highly for their nature relatedness. In another study, pooling data from actually 8 different studies using psilocybin with healthy participants, in 38% of those patients was they reported a sort of enduring increase in their appreciation for nature and the environment. Another interesting long-term effect that psychedelics like psilocybin have is increasing personality trait openness, which is one of the big 5 measures of personality. And it's an interesting one in that it's the only personality trait that's associated with certain cognitive abilities. Generally, it's thought your personality is more or less fixed by the age of 30, and openness is thought to maybe even go down as you age. So openness is associated with things like creativity, appreciation for aesthetics, hunger for knowledge, and new experiences. But it's also, of all the personality traits, it seems the strongest at predicting pro-environmental behaviour and nature relatedness. So this was a really important study that came out a few years ago, and this was this was showing in an interesting way that sort of, lifetime experience with the classical psychedelics increases, and not other tested substances, it was a unique thing for the psychedelics, increased nature relatedness. And this was specifically through an increase in people's self-identification with nature, their nature relatedness. And they controlled for personality type as well, so they took the openness into account as well. So, this is some very fresh, currently unpublished, but hopefully at some point published data, courtesy of the Psychedelic Research Group at Imperial College. This is some online survey data. And what this is showing is sort of lifetime usage of classical psychedelics and nature relatedness scores. And it produced this amazingly strong relationship between lifetime exposure to psychedelics and nature relatedness increase. And there was a particularly strong increase in people who rated below average for nature relatedness prior to their psychedelic experiences. They had this big increase. And the nature relatedness as well is correlated with well-being, we found. And what this sort of data, although this is kind of like quite fresh and sort of cutting edge stuff, it suggests at least that psychedelics may play a role in facilitating increased nature connection in people who might be lacking in that connection. In terms of, not growing up around nature from a young age seems to predict one's nature connection later through life. And if some people haven't been fortunate enough to grow up in nature, this could be a means of sort of reconnecting them. It's interesting, I know from a reliable source that Albert Hofmann took great joy in hearing accounts of people who reconnected with nature through their LSD experiences. So just sort of like how this connection to nature may be experienced. So before I enjoyed nature, now I feel part of it. Before I was looking at as a thing, like a TV or a painting. You're a part of it, there's no separation or distinction, you are it. I felt like sunshine twinkling through leaves, I was nature. This long-term increase in nature connection and environmental concern is also a long-term after effect of near-death experiences, interestingly. And this is a sort of nice way of sort of interpreting how this increased connection that psychedelics can catalyze can foster this pro-environmental awareness. If the self is expanded to include the natural world, behavior leading to destruction of the world will be experienced as self-destruction. And I should say, psychedelics are not the only means of experiencing nature connection. Just being in nature is sufficient. But as mentioned, if people don't already have a pre-existing connection to nature, they can be valuable tools. So what about, rather than vilifying these compounds, what if we were to hold them in the same high regard that some indigenous groups do? If we safeguarded rather than outlawed them, how would our ecological situation now and future look? Reflecting on his life work at the mighty age of 101, Albert Hofmann came to feel that the capacity of psychedelics to reconnect us to nature was the fundamentally most important property they have. And he said, alienation from nature and the loss of the experience of being part of the living creation is the greatest tragedy of our materialistic era. It is the causative reason for ecological devastation and climate change. Therefore, I attribute absolute highest importance to consciousness change. I regard psychedelics as catalyzers of this. I concur with this view, and given our current ecological predicament, I feel that this capacity of psychedelics to increase nature relatedness needs to be moved from a side interest to the central stage. To ensure preservation of the biosphere, and the survival of our species, we require a fundamental psychological shift at the population level, and we urgently need to regain our connection to nature. There is no more important goal than this. Thank you.